Psalm 83. Today we're going to be looking at a prophetic passage, strangely from this particular psalm, which was written by Asaph. And as we continue in our studies into Bible prophecy, this is one of the other passages that we will be looking at and glean from what it says, because interestingly, this is a prophetic psalm. So Psalm 83. Welcome to this channel, Life Lessons from the Bible, and welcome once again to another study into prophetic scriptures and trying to understand the days we are in. And as a result of that, understanding what we need to do, how we need to function. And so, as I said, we are today in the 83rd Psalm. This Psalm was written by Asaph, and very interestingly, it is a prophetic Psalm. And as we go through it, you will see, it actually speaks about what is going on today in the Middle East. And it doesn't only give us information about what is taking place, but it speaks about where all these things are headed to in the near future. And so we have a description, we have an understanding, we have a behind the scenes account of what is going on. Apart from what we have in the news, this psalm will give us some more information that is not readily available to us by the media outlet. But it's also going to give us where things are headed to as it relates to the Middle East with respect to the present conflicts that are taking place there between Hamas, Lebanon, Israel, the Houthis, and even Iran as well. And so this will be a very interesting psalm. So Psalm 83, let's get into this without any more detail. The Bible starts off, first of all, as I said, it was written by Asaph. Asaph, if you remember from the Old Testament, was considered a seer or a prophet as well. And so this is one of the psalms that he wrote. It's a prayer to God. But as we go through it, you would see it is a prophetic passage as well. And so he begins, Psalm 83 verse 1, Keep not thou silence, O God. Hold not thy peace, and be not still, O God. Very interestingly, hold not thy peace, and do not be still, O God. As we go through this psalm, the approach we would use is basically guided by how this psalm was written. This psalm was written in what we might call paragraphs or stanzas. In the literature of the psalmist, it was called strophes or strophe, as some people might say. And there are different strophes. The first strophe is a group of verses from verse 1 to verse 4. And then there's another group from verse 5 to verse 8, verse 9 to verse 12, and then verse 13 to verse 18. So in trying to understand the psalm, we will analyze it in those particular strophes or paragraphs, because that is how the writer intended it to be understood, so we could get the message he wants us to get. So the first one is verse 1 to verse 4. When he says in verse 1, Keep not thou silence, O God, hold not thy peace, and be not still, O God, he begins here with a very, is like a tension grabber. He is crying out to God and he's asking God for help. So he begins in a very, very strong way, a very strong appeal. And he uses very strong words. Do not keep silent. The word silent there means do not be at rest. Do not remain at rest. In other words, be active. Get up and act. He says, hold not your peace. The word peace there means, in the original Hebrew, don't be speechless. In other words, say things. Don't only act, but speak. And then he says, do not remain still. The word still there means undisturbed. In other words, he is saying, busy yourself about what is going on here. Get involved. See what is taking place. And he's asking God to make a decree, say things about what is taking place with respect to this group of people, Israel's enemies that are coming against them, and become active, deal with them. And so he begins this psalm in a very strong way by saying, God, do something and say something. Don't just be sitting idly by. He said, and the reason why he says he's asking God to do that is because verse 2, he says, thine enemies make a tumult, and they that hate thee have lifted up their head. Very interestingly, he didn't say the enemies of Israel, or he didn't say my enemies. He said your enemies. And that's very, very important. In this prophetic psalm, the focus here, he begins is by saying, God, your enemies are doing things. They are doing wicked things. So don't remain silent and don't remain inactive. Do something and say something. But it's interesting how he terms it is your enemies, because as we will see, this psalm really speaks about what Israel's enemies will plan to do against them. But Israel's enemies, he is saying here, is really your enemies, O Lord. Verse 3, they have taken, he says, in verse 2, he says, when your enemies have made a tumult. The word tumult there, and very interesting, is commotion. And the word, when he says they have lifted up their head, that means rebellion. So when you put the two together, commotion or noisy commotion and rebellion, what he is saying here is your enemies, they are making a noisy rebellion against you, against your people, but it's really against you. So get involved here, God, and do something. And this is what the psalm is about. Verse 3, they have taken crafty counsel against thy people and consulted against thy hidden ones. So he says, this is your enemies acting, but what they are doing is they are coming against your people. So because they are coming against your people, they are therefore your enemies. Very important. They have taken crafty counsel. Crafty there means cunning, but the word counsel has to do with sharing information in secret. In other words, they are having confidential meetings. They are planning in secret. That's what he is saying there. Crafty counsel. And he says, not only that, but they take counsel against thy hidden ones. The word consulted there, they have consulted against thy hidden ones. Consulted means to conspire, to come together, plot, and conspire against your hidden ones. The word hidden actually means protected ones. It's very interesting. So he is saying here, this is what's going on, Lord. Your enemies coming against your people, and they are conspiring, they are plotting together. They are having confidential meetings, but together they are planning in secret to come and to fight against your protected people. So arise, Lord, and defend your people, fight for your people. Verse 4, he says, they have said, come, let us cut them off from being a nation, that the name of Israel may be no more in remembrance. Very interesting. Here is where Asaph is getting to the motivation or the reason why the enemies of Israel is coming against them. This enemy or enemies, they are motivated in what they do. And what is their motivation? It says their desire is to two specific things: to cut off Israel from being a nation, that is number one, and to ensure that the name of Israel may be no more remembered. This is very, very interesting. When he talks about cutting off, that word actually in the Hebrew means annihilate. That means these enemies, and later on he will specify who are the enemies, so we will identify them. But he says these enemies want to annihilate your people. That's very, very important. They don't just want to fight against your people. They want to remove them completely. Remove them from their land, kill the people, slaughter them. But then also, verse 4 says, they also want to remove even the remembrance of the name Israel. That's very interesting. The remembrance. So they don't only want to destroy the people, they don't want even the remembrance of them to exist. This is pure hate. What he is describing here is a group of Israel's enemies who are not motivated by some external factor. Every one of them is motivated by the same internal desire, the same internal goal. And so this is very powerful. It is one thing to motivate somebody with something external to them. But anytime somebody has a desire and you work on that desire, that is a very strong motivation. And that is what is going on here. They are motivated by this desire to remove Israel. And we know that's what's going on today. More and more as you read this passage, you could see it is exactly what is playing out today. And it will get worse as this passage shows us. Verse 5. For they have consulted together with one consent. They are confederate against thee. It's very interesting words that he used. They have consulted together. The word with one consent. The word consent there is from the Hebrew is the word heart or mind or thinking. So, in other words, he is saying they have come together to discuss things in secret, to consult and to, discuss things in secret, but they are doing it with one heart. This is important. Regardless of what these different enemies of Israel's issues might be with each other, they have one common binding thread, and that is their hearts or their minds and agreed together. They have the same thinking when it comes to Israel. And we will see who these nations are specifically. But even before we talk about the nations, we need to understand the foundation. These people have the same thinking as it relates to Israel. They have one heart or one mind. And with that same thinking, they consult together in private or they conspire in private. Even though these enemies might have issues with each other, even though these enemies might have other problems taking place, even though these enemies might at times fight each other, yet when it comes to Israel, they are united very strongly with that. And this is one of the things we need to understand. What is going on in the Middle East today is not just a squabble that could finish quickly. It is a group of nations coming against Israel, but they are united in the way that they think concerning Israel. They are united in their desires towards Israel. So they might have issues with each other, but there's an underlying hatred towards Israel. And that hatred is motivating them to act. And what they want to do is to annihilate Israel. And this is one of the things that we need to understand when it comes to what's going on in the Middle East, what is going on now with respect to Israel and its neighbors, and even as we move more and more into the future. This issue is not an issue about getting land. This issue is not an issue about having a capital in Jerusalem. This is not an issue about Israel even fighting against Hamas or fighting against Hezbollah and killing people. That is not the real issue. The real issue is these nations, these people, this group of Israel's enemies simply want to wipe Israel off the map because there's a deep-seated hatred towards Israel. So even if they get land, but Israel is still existing, they will not be happy. Even if they get Jerusalem to be their own capital, but Israel is still existing as a people, they will not be happy. Even if they move Israel out of the land and they populate the land, but the people of Israel are still living, they will not be happy because their desire is to remove Israel from the land, kill the people of Israel, annihilate them, and then get the memory of Israel to be forgotten. And so, no matter what concessions Israel does today, it will not bring peace in the Middle East. The only way the enemies of Israel will stop is when Israel is no more existent and forgotten. And of course, God will not allow that. And this psalm will go on to show exactly that. So he goes on in verse 6 to actually identify who are these enemies. Oh, before we go on to that, in verse 5, he says they have consulted together with one consent. They are confederate against thee. The word confederate there is berit, and it means a covenant. So this is very interesting. These people have made a covenant with each other. And when we study passages like Ezekiel chapter 30 and 39, we will see that Iran is really at the head of that. But these people have made a covenant with each other. And the covenant is we're going to annihilate Israel and even annihilate the memory of Israel. And they are bounded together by that covenant. So these people are very, very motivated. Sometimes we say, how is it Israel bombing out the Gaza Strip, bombing out Hezbollah in Lebanon, and even now bombing out the Houthis as well, and they still keep fighting? Sometimes you ask the question, are they not learning? Do they not know that Israel will keep fighting? And the thing is, they will never stop because they have made a covenant with each other to fight against Israel. And that covenant is motivated by the same shared hatred they have for Israel. And so he lists who are these enemies we are speaking about. He tells us in this psalm who are the enemies. And you would see as we go through it, it is exactly the people who are involved and some others who will get involved soon. He says, the first of all, verse 6, the tabernacles of Edom and the Ishmaelites, of Moab and the Hagarenes. Or before we even go there, I just want to remind us, verse 1 to verse 4 is the first strophe, or the first paragraph, we could say. And the focus in that first one was getting God's attention and asking him to intervene. The second strophe, for the second paragraph, is verse 5 to verse 8, which is where we are in. And this is talking about the group of nations who are Israel's enemies. And this is where we are. He's talking about the enemies. Verse 6, the tabernacles of Edom and the Ishmaelites, of Moab and the Hagarenes. Verse 7, Gebal and Ammon and Amalek, the Philistines with the inhabitants of Tyre. Verse 8, Asa or Assyria is also joined with them. They have helped the children of Lot, Selah. So he identifies 10 groups of people here, and we are going to explain who these people are in today's nations around Israel. So first of all, he begins with the tabernacles of Edom. The word tabernacle there, in the Hebrew, it actually means the tents that the nomads use when they travel through the desert areas. So this is really talking about nomadic tents or tabernacles. It really refers to nomadic tents. He says the tabernacles are the tents of Edom. Edom refers to mainly the southern part of Jordan. The southern part of Jordan, and it also refers to the Palestinian refugees who live in the southern part of Jordan, but they also live in some other areas like in the West Bank. Some of them live in the Gaza Strip. But the main area is the southern part of Jordan. He talks about the Ishmaelites. The Ishmaelites are the people who settled in Saudi Arabia. So Saudi Arabia is identified here. Moab refers to central Jordan. And some of the Palestinian refugees scattered in different places. But it mainly refers to central Jordan. The Hagarenes refers to Egypt, which is down south of Israel. Verse 7, he talks about Gebal. Gebal refers to the northern part of Lebanon. And of course, Hezbollah functions in Lebanon. He talks about Ammon. Ammon refers to the northern part of Jordan. And again, it also refers to the Palestinian refugees scattered in different places. But mainly, Ammon refers to the northern part of Jordan. Amalek refers to the Arabs who live in the Sinai Peninsula, that is towards the south of Israel. And so, the nation or the people that settle in that area, the Arabs, that is what Amalek refers to. Philistines refer to the Gaza Strip, where Hamas functioned, because they have been greatly reduced. The inhabitants of Tyre. Tyre refers to the southern part of Lebanon, again where Hezbollah functions. Verse 8, Asa or Assyria is basically today modern day Syria, and it also involves parts of northern Iraq. But the main area is present day Syria. And then he talks about the children of Lot in verse 8. The children of Lot refer to Moab and Ammon, who we spoke about already. So he identifies the nations who are coming against Israel, whom he wants God to rise up and fight against. And so just quickly, the nations are Jordan, Saudi Arabia, Egypt, Lebanon, people from the Sinai Peninsula, the Gaza Strip, Syria, and parts of Iraq. So one more time, these nations he's talking about are Jordan, Saudi Arabia, Egypt, Lebanon, the Sinai Peninsula, the Gaza Strip, and today what we would call Syria and parts of northern Iraq. He says these nations are the nations that are coming together against your people, and I'm asking you God to fight against them. Now, of these nations listed here, the present group who we see active, very active, is really Lebanon, Hezbollah, Hamas in the Gaza Strip. We are seeing the Houthis, which are part of Saudi Arabia, down to the Yemen, the bottom part of Saudi Arabia. We are seeing these major actors, and also Syria has been involved. Of course, Bashar al-Assad is not there anymore, but Syria has been and still is involved in these attacks against Israel. So we have a majority of the actors listed here presently involved in these fightings against Israel. Who are not yet heavily involved is Jordan and, of course, Egypt, not very heavily involved as yet. But according to this, they will be. As we move forward in this warfare and this fighting that we see in the Middle East, we will see Jordan get involved. We will see Saudi Arabia get involved against Israel. We will also see Egypt get involved. And I want to say one thing. It may not necessarily be the whole of Jordan getting involved to fight against Israel, or the whole of Saudi Arabia, the whole of Egypt. What it really may involve is the radical elements, the radical people in those countries coming out and joining forces with the other countries to fight against Israel. This is the prayer that Asaph is asking God. This is what he's asking God to do. He told God, don't sleep, don't stay quiet, but get up and fight. What exactly is he asking God to do? This is the prayer from verse 9. And actually, this verse 9 to verse 12 is the other strophe, the other paragraph. So it's an area, these 9, 10, 11, and 12 are verses that have one theme or one particular topic. Verse 9, it says, do unto them as unto the Midianites, as to Sisera, as to Jabin at the brook of Kishon, which perished at Endor. They became as dung for the earth. If you want to read about Sisera and Jabin, you need to go down to Judges chapter 4. Read that chapter, Judges chapter 4, and you get some more information and understanding. But essentially, Jabin was the king of the group of people who lived in the northern part of Canaan when Israel came to the promised land. And Sisera was his chief captain or his general over the army. And they were in, for many years, their custom was to harass Israel and to come up against Israel. And Israel eventually cried out to God. And God intervened. He raised up, and of course, Deborah was the judge there at that point in time. And Barak was there. But he raised up a judge to deliver them. What's interesting here, Asaph is asking God the same thing you did to Jabin and Sisera, do it to these nations that are coming against Israel now. What happened to Sisera was very interesting. Sisera was running from Israel. And eventually, when he reached a particular place, a woman whose family was at peace with him told him, well, come and hide here. And when he went into the house, she put him in a particular place to hide. While hiding, he fell asleep. And very interestingly, that same woman turned around, took a nail and a hammer, put it on his temple while his head was on the ground, and struck the nail through his head. And the nail went into the ground. He died. He died by the hand of a woman. And this is what Asaph is asking God to do to these enemies that are coming against Israel. Is a brutal murder. But is a murder at the hands of a woman, not even at the hand of a trained soldier. This was a very cheap way to die. This is the general of one of Israel's enemies being killed by a woman who's not even trained in warfare. And he's asking God, do that kind of things against these enemies that come right now. In other words, let them be embarrassed. They're top people being killed by nobodies. That's what he is saying. And of course, the king Jabin was killed by people of Israel later on. And so he was saying that to them. But one of the other things I want to point out, in Judges chapter 4, verse 15, the Bible says God confused Sisera and his chariot drivers. And that's very important. God was the one who brought confusion in how they operated, and it resulted in them being defeated. And he is saying, God, bring confusion against these enemies. Let them run helter-skelter, not knowing what to do. And in the midst of the confusion, let them be killed, let them be slaughtered. It's a very graphic prayer, but it's the prayer that is needed against Israel's enemies, because Israel's enemies is really the enemies of God. And so this is what he said there. Then he goes on in verse 11 and 12. Make their nobles like Oreb and like Zeb, yea, all their princes, make them like Zebah and Zalmunna, who said, let us take to ourselves the houses of God in possession. If you want to read about Oreb, Zeb, Zebah, and Zalmunna, these are Midianites. You go to Judges chapter 7, verse 19, all the way down to Judges chapter 8, verse 21. You'll see all the details there. But essentially, Zebah and Zalmunna were the kings in Midian, and Oreb and Zeb were generals of the army. And of course, they came to fight against Israel. God raised up Gideon at that time to come and defend Israel. One of the interesting things is God put confusion amongst them. And that's very important. Judges chapter 7 verse 22. God caused the Midianites to fight against each other. Just as he caused confusion with Sisera and his army, he caused confusion with the army within the army of the Midianites. So they began to fight each other. And Asaph is saying, God, do this again. You caused them to be confused and fight against each other. Do it now. You did it once, do it again. Cause these people to be confused and to even turn against each other. The generals, Oreb and Zeb, they were not just killed, they were actually beheaded. It was a gruesome murder. And this is the kind of things that Asaph is praying to be done against these modern day enemies of Israel. It's very strong prayers. But listen to their motivation. In verse 12, let us take to ourselves the houses of God. Let us take to ourselves. The term take to ourselves really and truly in the Hebrew, it actually means to dispossess. So they are saying, what Asaph is saying, these enemies want to remove Israel from their land. That's one of their goals. They want to dispossess Israel. And they want to take that land for themselves. And God, he's asking God, stop them. Prevent them. Don't let them be able to do that. But then he goes on. He says, this last portion of the psalm, this last strophe, is from verse 13 all the way to the end in verse 18. He says, what you did in the past, do it again. But also I'm asking you, verse 13. Oh my God, make them like a wheel. Make them as a stubble before the wind. The word wheel there actually means whirlwind. And stubble is like the chaff. It's like the kernel that is remains when you take out the corn and so on. It's basically all the things that remain after you harvest the crops. Those things could be blown away. And they are blown away by the wind, like blown away by the whirlwind. So he is saying here in verse 13, make these enemies of Israel like people who could easily be blown away by the wind. In other words, God removed them. Just as a wind blows away the dust and blows away what remains after harvest, blow them away. Strong wind. Verse 14, he says, as fire burneth a wood, and as the flame sets the mountains on fire, so persecute them with your tempest, and make them afraid with your storm. So he talks about fire now, burn them, like fire burns wood, burn them up. He moved from wind into something even more devastating, fire. And in verse 15, the word tempest means storm, a raging storm. It's like a hurricane. Actually, in verse 15, he says, make them afraid with thy storm. That word storm there really could be translated hurricane. More violent destruction. So he talks about wind, but then even more violent to that is the fire. And then even more violent than that is the storm, hurricane, strong winds. So he is saying, God, more and more, be more and more aggressive against them. Don't sit quiet. Don't remain quiet, but become aggressive in attacking them. That's what he's asking God to do. He says in verse 16, fill their faces with shame that they may seek thy name. And so this last part is really where he begins to focus on the glory of God. He is saying, do this. Fill their faces with shame. In other words, disgrace them. But disgrace them so that they will seek thy name, O Lord. The word name in the Hebrew means fame. It means the honor. That's very important. So what he is saying to them, he is saying, disgrace them so that they would recognize your fame. They would recognize that you are really God. They would recognize that it is your power that is the greatest. That you are God. And the word Lord there is Jehovah or Yehovah, as we say. It's very interesting. In the first part of the Psalm, verse 1, he used the word Elohim and El to describe God. But here he uses the word Yehovah or Jehovah, as we say in English. Elohim or El, Hebrew words for God, could refer to God generally as creator. But the word Yehovah or Jehovah means specifically the God of Israel. The word Yehovah means the self-existent one, the one who needs nobody else. But only Israel refers to God by that name. So when he says, let these enemies seek thy name, Jehovah, what he's saying, let them recognize that you and your fame, really, you are the God of Israel, and there's only you, the God of Israel, and only your fame is to be recognized and praised. And that is what he is saying here. He says in verse 17, let them be confounded and troubled forever. Let them be put to shame and perish. Very interesting. The word confounded means to be disappointed. The word trouble means to be terrified. And the word perish means to be exterminated. So he's saying, let them be disappointed, let them be terrified, let them be exterminated. They want to annihilate us, but I'm asking you, God, annihilate them. Each of these words, confounded, trouble, put to shame, and perish, in the Hebrew, it is in what is called the imperfect tense. That's the grammar, the imperfect tense. And the imperfect tense means continuing action with no end. In other words, let them be confounded forever and it'll never stop. Let them be ashamed forever. Let them be exterminated forever. There's no coming back from that. They will always be in that state. That's what he is saying in verse 17. As he pray, he is praying. And verse 18, again he is saying that they may know that you, whose name alone is Jehovah, are the Most High over all the earth. This is interesting. He begins this psalm in verse 1 by talking about God using the name Elohim and El. But he ends this psalm in verse 18 by referring to God as Jehovah or Yehovah in the Hebrew, which is the God that only Israel worships. And he is saying, fight against these enemies so that they would recognize that you, the God of Israel, is the only God. Not just the only God, but the Most High over all. Over all the earth. God, do this for your glory. That is his prayer. That is his request. What could we learn from this? What are the prophetic lessons we could get from this? And what are the life lessons we could get to apply to us today as we move forward? First of all, Israel's close neighbors will plan and execute an attack against it. And we are seeing that going on right now. The neighbors close around it, directly around Israel. Lebanon to the north, Syria to the side, Jordan to the side, Saudi Arabia, basically the Houthis and Yemen down to the bottom. People in the Negev area, the Sinai area, and even Egypt further down south. All these nations immediately around Israel, this chapter is saying, will plot and fight against Israel and attack them. All these players have not as yet done that. Only some. We have only seen Hezbollah, we have only seen Hamas, we have seen the Houthis, but we haven't seen Jordan doing anything as yet. We haven't seen other parts of Saudi Arabia. We have seen Syria involved, but not as great as this chapter is saying, this psalm. So what we will see is this war in Israel will get worse. And more, these other actors will get involved. And they will execute an even greater attack on Israel. But God will intervene eventually. He will invade, and he will defeat them by using the army in Israel, the Israel Defense Force. The army in Israel will get stronger and stronger. The military might of Israel will increase. And with all these enemies coming against them, they will be more and more successful. It started off with Hamas. They did it with Hezbollah in Lebanon. Now they are fighting against the Houthis. and they are going against Iran as well. And we talk about Iran later on as we talk about Ezekiel 38 and 39. But these neighbors that are close by Israel, they will come against Israel more. This war is not going to stop right now. Prophetically, this war will continue and will get even worse and more intense. But Israel will be more and more successful in the war. And of course, as they are more and more successful, what to expect? The UN will condemn them. The United Nations will condemn Israel more and more. And they will talk more and more about the humanitarian crisis and all these other things. But what they will not do is talk about the enemies that come against Israel. We will see Israel being brought up to the ICC, International Criminal Court, and all kinds of warrants being issued against the Prime Minister and other people. We will see that more and more happening because this war will continue. However, Israel, after they defeat this group of enemies, this will lead to them living securely, not peacefully, but living securely. In other words, they will have a measure of success in the Middle East, military success and military might. So Israel, after they deal with this present group of enemies, will become more secure. Not peaceful, because they will always have fighting. But even in the fighting, they will be secure because they will emerge as a military power in the Middle East. However, after they are successful defeating this present batch of enemies, this will then lead to another warfare again that Ezekiel 38 and 39 talks about. In that warfare, Russia will join with Iran and many other nations. And in Ezekiel chapter 38 verse 11, the Bible says that they will come against Israel because Israel will be living in safety or security. That's very specific. Ezekiel 38 verse 11 says, God says, in those days, God is talking to Gog, and he says, thoughts will come into your mind to go up against a land who's dwelling safely and securely, unwalled villages and so on. They are secure. The reason why Israel will be secured, and the reason why Gog, which is basically the leader in Russia, and then Iran, and many other countries, the reason why they will come against Israel, when you read Ezekiel 30 and 39, is because they will come for spoil, they will come for plunder, they will come because they see Israel dwelling in safety. Why will Israel have plunder? Why will Israel have things that these nations want to come for? Is because Israel will be successful in this present war. Israel will increase more and more out of this present war. And when Russia and Iran and many other countries see the success of Israel in this current war, it will cause them to want to come even more against Israel. And that will lead us into this war in Ezekiel 38 and 39 talks about the war with Gog, the leader from Russia, and Iran and other countries as well. We talk about that some other time. Why are these wars taking place? Psalm 83. This is where we get to some life lessons. Psalm 83 and Ezekiel 38 and 39. Why do we see these wars? The reason is because in these last days we are living in, there is more and more a war between the gate of God, which is Israel, and the gate of the gods, plural, which is Babylon. When you read Genesis chapter 11, you see that Babel, which became Babylon, was really the original place where Satan began his rule. The word Babel or Bab-El means the gate of the gods. Bab is gate and El is God. So they named it Bab-El. We say it means confusion. But really it means the gate of the gods. And so that was the place where Satan set up his empire. And it is getting back. That will be the focus again, Babylon, or the gate of the gods. So it is the gate of the gods, Babylon, fighting against the gate of God, Israel. Why is it called the gate of God? Why is Israel called the gate of God? Because if you remember when Jacob, he was running before he became Israel, he fell asleep. And when he fell asleep in the promised land, the Bible says he dreamt a ladder and the angels going up and down. And he says, this is the house of God. This is the gate of God. So Israel is the gate of God, but Babylon is the gate of the gods, satanic gate. And these two gates are fighting against each other in this time we are living in. And this is what's causing the increase in the intensity of demonic warfare. And this is why these things will be happening to Israel. But one of the other thing in that is it will become more and more intense for the church. Because as the intensity increases against Israel, what automatically happens after that is it becomes more intense for us, the church. That's a principle. All right. So, and what we have also going on right now is the return of many of these ruling spirits that functioned so many years ago, hundreds and thousands of years ago. Many of these chief demonic spirits are once again returning or once again rising up and functioning today. So the demonic spirit over Babylon and all the wicked spirits with respect to that are functioning once again. And because these spirits are rising up again and functioning again, the intensity of our warfare is greater. And so we as believers need to become even more intense in our warfare and even closer in our walk with God. Because one of the things that happens when these demonic spirits begin functioning more and more is that they attack us. And one of the ways they attack us is through our minds with deception. The Bible tells us that there will be doctrines of devils in the last days. And so we need to sharpen ourselves against these attacks and against these deception. We should understand that the intensity of demonic and angelic activities is increasing more and more. And it will increase even more as we get closer and closer to the end. Angels are functioning even more and more, and so too are demonic spirits. The spiritual climate is much more intense now than it was before. And if the church, if the believers do not become more focused on their individual walk with God, we will be deceived. We will become less effective, and we will even become more and more corrupted in our own lives. And we won't even realize it because we will be deceived. And as I said, we need to grow in our personal relationship with God so we could become strong and successful. That's what Daniel 11:32 says, is the people that know their God will be strong and do exploits. That verse was spoken in the context of the last days. This is the time we are living in now. So Daniel 11:32 is a verse for our time. We need to become more self-sufficient, especially with finances, so we could face global issues. And this is a practical application, a practical life lesson. These wars we are seeing in the Middle East and other parts of the world, but we're talking specifically the Middle East, will have more effects on the global financial scene. And so as these wars will continue and they will get even more intense, globally, financial issues will become more and more problematic. So on a personal level, we need to ensure that we are more secured and self-sufficient financially. Make sure our savings are in order, make sure our investments are in order, so we could stand up against financial things. We need to be wary of news reports and government information. So even though we read the newspaper, we look at the news, we listen to our states, governments, and even United Nations, we need to listen and hear, but not readily accept everything. Well, we need to check, double check. We need to be wary of this. There's this thing called cancel culture and being woke. We need to be very careful with that. Cancel culture is where you just, you cut off certain people because you believe they are saying things which are destructive to society. So because somebody says homosexuality and lesbianism is not right, then you want to, the push in society now is to cancel that person. Don't buy their products, condemn them, ostracize them. And then wokeism is where you want to say, I am supporting these people, these lesbians and so on, because that's their lifestyle and we want to be equal. We need to be careful with these kinds of things because as we move forward and these wars intensify, demonic spirits will be becoming more and more active in their deception. And so we as the church need to be careful with that. And we need to have an answer to our society when they raise these societal issues. There's the military warfare, there's one part. But then there's the warfare with the ideologies and the belief system. And that is even more serious. That's where the deception comes in. So you need to be careful with this thing called wokeism and cancel culture. We as the church need to have an answer for these issues in our culture today. We need to be able to know how to answer these things, how to stand up, how to give a proper biblical worldview, and to be able to guard ourselves and our families against these deceptions. So this is where we are. Psalm 83, a very prophetic psalm. And so as always, would like to invite you to share this video, like this video, follow this social media platform. And if you have any queries or comments, feel free to put them in the comment section. But I want to thank you for joining me in this video, and I'm praying God's blessings on you. Look out for other videos as we delve more, especially Ezekiel 38 and 39, very key passage. So until the next time, thank you very much for joining me. I pray God's blessings and best on you.